Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's Caring for the Caregiver virtual support group hosted by Sutter Health and Community Hospice. We're so happy to have you join us today. Today, we have a great topic. It's prolonged grieving, and today's presenter is Erica White. Erica is one of our licensed clinical social workers. She is a clinician here at Community Hospice, and we'd like to welcome Erica.
Hi, welcome. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, we're going to talk about prolonged grieving. Next slide. So here at Community Hospice, we recognize that grief and how we mourn looks different for everyone, and as well as time frames and what the symptoms are. Grief is an unfortunate experience that everyone encounters at some point in life. It comes in various forms, such as with the death of a loved one, a change in a relationship or life role, or when a serious illness occurs. But for the purpose of today's presentation, we will focus on grief related to the death of a loved one. Next slide. Grief is a natural process. The symptoms of grief present differently in each individual. They can manifest emotionally, physically, and/or socially. For some people, feelings of loss are debilitating and don't improve even after time passes. Next slide. Common symptoms of grief. Grief symptoms may include headaches, stomach aches, loss of appetite, difficulty sleeping, nightmares, isolation, blaming self, poor concentration, forgetfulness, anger and irritability, blaming others, sadness, depression, low energy, fatigue, very emotionally draining, questioning beliefs, fear of death. Next slide. So for a long time, we've had different understandings. There were the stages of griefs. Sometimes grief can follow a general arc of, shock, denial, coming to terms with it, carrying on. Sometimes it's a roller coaster of varying symptoms and stages that has a general arc, or it may be a roller coaster of emotions completely out of any order. Sometimes we reference the 4 tasks of grief that was made popular by Dr. Alan Wolfelt. And sometimes we refer to General 5 Stages of Grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And that was per her studies of people adjusting to their terminal illness. But there's been a lot of adding on to that, such as this 7 stages of grief and loss. And next slide. And that would have been, a 12-month time frame. And so knowing that that's a temporary part of life, it didn't always allow a lot of treatment options. So now we have the prolonged grief disorder. That was listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM-5, as a condition for further study. Initially, it was called the Persistent Complex Bereavement Disorder. So now the 2022 release is calling it prolonged grief disorder. And that states that after 12 months, if there's still an impairment, that we are looking at being able to bill our health insurance and having expanded mental health treatment that recognizes that it's debilitating and you haven't been able to get the treatment that you needed. And so it expands treatment options. So here's that really objective clinical definition of that in our DSM update, that the death at least 12 months ago of a person who was close to the bereaved individual. For children and adolescents, it's at least 6 months ago. So since the death, the development of a persistent grief response characterized by one of the following symptoms, which have been present most days to a clinically significant degree. It's the intense yearning, longing for the deceased. If you can imagine just a large distraction to your day-to-day activity of daily living, working, and really a continued disruption to your sleeping, eating, and, self-care patterns. Next slide. And here's some more what we call qualifiers. Maybe in the first year you didn't have access to treatment, or you stayed busy, or didn't have that education of what grief should look like, can look like, how to help, how to receive help. And you thought maybe just staying busy, not talking about it, ignoring it, that can sometimes prolong your healing journey. And so in that second or third or, ongoing time frame, ongoing years, this may just be your unique experience, that this one person was such an important part of your life that no matter what treatment you did pursue and care that you did, give to yourself, that it is still very difficult to concentrate and go on. And we recognize that. So since the death, at least 3 of the following symptoms have been present most days. And you have an impairment because of that. So here's, that second and ongoing year, what you're still feeling to qualify for this disorder. Emotional numbness, feeling like life is meaningless, intense loneliness. Next slide is other qualifiers that may be assessed by a qualified professional. These can be rather subjective, such as ruling out major depressive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, an adjustment disorder, and trying to assess whether, maybe your culture, your household has, different expectations. So, meeting with a licensed clinical therapist or social worker can help to kind of see if this is what you're feeling, or if there's something else that kind of relates to history, even before the passing of your loved one. Next slide. So once you've identified that maybe you are feeling a prolonged grief disorder impairment, this is the treatment. There has been a question about further assessing PTSD, and that would be related to trauma, maybe something in your childhood, maybe something in your young adult years, maybe some experiences that, anxiety, kind of jumpiness, hypersensitivity, to certain things that came before even the death of your loved one. And so you can meet with a counselor and see if this looks like trauma, PTSD, or if this is still grief that just wasn't processed and just hasn't kind of ran its course. And maybe sometimes it's just extending education of what grief can look like, that there are going to be triggers, that there are going to be spikes in those feelings that look very raw and like the beginning of your healing journey, like closer to when the death happened, but not knowing if that's typical to feel like you're kind of going backwards. So, bouncing off these ideas and these observations off a trained professional would be helpful. So treatment for prolonged grief disorder is going to be individual counseling, group therapy, maybe medication therapy. Locally, we do have some support groups, such as Grief Share and the Compassionate Friends. And if there's death loss related to suicide, we have a support group for that. You can also reference online, you can look up Friends Are Good Medicine for a lot of support groups in the area, as well as the Stanislaus Connections newsletter. At the last page, they reference a lot of our ongoing support groups for grief and other issues, health issues. A lot of people access Facebook groups, looking into specifically how you lost that individual. I know Paul Deniston is a leading voice in grief education, and he has a program called Tender Hearts. Some people might want to, privately address this at home and appreciate books, and I recommend and hear a lot of people refer to Healing After Loss, which are daily meditations to kind of set that intention and allow those emotions to come up either before you start your day or at the end of your day. So you're not stuffing that inside. The author of that book is Martha Hickman. Another popular one, kind of in that daily meditation, carving out time to mourn, is Grieving One Day at a Time. And that's by Dr. Alan Wolfelt. Another leading voice. He has a great website, a lot of resources to kind of explore how you're feeling and if you've really dealt with this in all capacities and given yourself enough time and really sat with that sadness and not try to find distractions, because that's our natural tendency, is kind of to pull your hand away from the fire. And we've seen that leaning into it and, trying to be really selfish with this need of your body is what contributes to healing. So there are a lot of stages of grief. I think I went over that, but I can definitely explore it further because it has been, talked about at length, that it's, it can go in order, it can go, all over the place, but educating yourself on either the 4 tasks of grief or the 7 stages of grief or the 5 stages of grief, any of that internet research, you can kind of see if you've given time to, any of this that you're dealing with. Next slide. So community hospice recognizes that the first year is really difficult. It allows it, it has that, you have that need of grief education is really helpful. And so for those of us that have utilized the hospice service, we do provide that as part of the benefit. For the prolonged grief disorder, we have Hope Counseling, and that's a relatively new program that we have that would be able to see if your health insurance might be able to pay for that. But if that's not an option, we do have a fee-based on a sliding scale. But I do want to close with this quote, and I don't have a slide for it, but I'll say it slowly. It's by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who has done a lot of research on grief and dying and coming to terms with a terminal illness. And I think she just says it really clearly. The reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Nor should you be the same, nor would you want to. Thank you for your time. I do have some time for questions. I know I went through that pretty quickly.
Thank you so much, Erica. We have, quite a few people stating how much they appreciated this and how helpful this was. And there's a comment that that quote really explains it for this person, and they're daily reminded. And they want to know, are you familiar with EMDR therapy?
I am familiar with EMDR. It's typically used for trauma. I haven't heard of it so much for grief, but it definitely can help you process things that have been jarring or traumatizing for you, whether you are able to recount that incident. But yeah, I researched someone that's trained in that area because it is a very specific skill set, but I'm familiar with that, yes.
And then there was a question. So when someone made a comment that they had a death that, they were working through, and they thought they were working through that first year and feeling better, but then they went through a divorce. And so then now they feel like it's starting all over again. So can you explain about, is that prolonged grieving, or why does it feel like it's starting all over again?
Yeah, that's very fresh, but it's also grief. it's loss, it's role change, it's rebuilding your next chapter, but like learning who you are, what your identity is, labels that are used. And so you might use a lot of the skills that you learned while you're grieving someone that's passed away with that divorce on, getting used to triggers, getting familiar with locations, and knowing that you're going to be experiencing shock. Wow, this is not how I envisioned my life. Sitting with that sadness, lessening that need to be productive and busy, and having really healthy boundaries, and slowly just processing. And there may be a fog, a lack of concentration, some forgetfulness, and then all of those emotions of anger and blame, and then essentially realizing this is grief. And once you kind of get through that, then it's that adjusting. I went from a Mrs. and then now would I be called a Ms. And, what my support system looks like, what groups I identify with, what are my newfound hobbies now that I'm going out as an individual? Am I considered single? So there's so much processing of your new identity. So that's adapting and evolving. And then I think kind of removing that, keeping their memory alive stage, but definitely rebuilding your new chapter and spending that time. Who am I? What are my interests? What did I do for that person? What did I do as a wife? And what do I now have this newfound freedom to not do anymore? So it definitely shifts, pulls the ground out from underneath you, and shifts your foundation. And it's a lot of the same skills that you're learning to rebuild who you are, whether it was without your parents, without your sibling. Who do I call when I want to reminisce and be nostalgic about that era when they were part of that chapter? Is it going to be journaling, or just digesting that is no longer, so it's a lot of the same things that you learned, but it's grief. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think there's also a question about children. It was mentioned that for children it's 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So how can they want to know if you can explain a little bit about more? How do I know if it's my child's grief after a year and it's not just something else?
That's such an interesting caveat for this, because children don't find their voice very quickly. They don't always find their words. They don't always, they have a hard time identifying that stomach ache is because they're sad. And so I might not be, I need to research this further, if it's losing a child or if it's the child experience. But the silver lining to that is the way it's written is if after 6 months, the child is still exhibiting any of these signs of grief, that you may be able to pursue health insurance for that. That's essentially what this DSM, this manual is for, is to give it those numbers to be able to bill insurance, where grief counseling before was, peer support, being able to go to a church, but not necessarily something that health insurance would fund. So opening this up doesn't say that there's something wrong with you. We don't want to pathologize that it's taking more time. The hope was to expand mental health, resources, and that funding source. So if your child is, having a lot of sick days, and they have recently lost someone, then you might be able to talk to their pediatrician and see if there's a child psychologist, or reach out to us. We are going out to schools. But it just lets you know that children experience it, even though they don't have the words to identify it, but it kind of comes out in a psychosomatic, they might have less energy than before, but sometimes it's just stomach aches, anxiety, fears. And so now you just have that is opened, that, those mental health resources are available and may be paid for now.
Thank you so much. There's a comment that just says, thank you for including on rebuilding my new chapter. I think they really appreciated that.
Yeah.
And also, before we end, unless someone else has any more questions, they wanted to know if you could, that quote from Kubler-Ross. Can you repeat that again, please?
Yeah,
that was
absolutely.
a great quote.
Okay. It's very beautiful, so I can scan it if I saw someone ask for that. The reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Nor should you be the same, nor would you want to.
That is beautiful, and that's actually perfect. So if no one has any more questions, Erica, thank you so much. Another great presentation. And you've given us so much to really think about and really look into ourselves. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We invite you to join us next month for our next Caring for the Caregiver. Well, we're going to be continuing our grief topic, and it's going to be understanding and identifying grief. We hope to see you here. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day and stay safe and be well. Bye-bye.